Japan expands and D-Day demands. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is April 5th, 2021. And on this date in history, in 1968, yesterday, MLK was assassinated while he was in Memphis, Tennessee, trying to lead the movement to improve the benefits for people working for the sanitation department of the city of Memphis. As a result of the actions that happened in France, the United States is going to take a series of actions to try and prevent war, but also to help their allies just in case there is a war. So they proposed the Lend-Lease Act, and so the U.S. could lend and lease arms to any country vital to U.S. defense. In addition, they had a series of neutrality acts that eventually would allow them to trade or sell weapons to warring countries, but we would no longer take the risk of shipping the items. And the day after France falls to Germany, the United States will institute the Selective Service and Training Act, having a military ready to fight in the event that we go into war, so we wouldn't get caught flat-footed. Now, with the Lend-Lease Act, the U.S. would lend or lease arms to countries vital to U.S. defense, so this is sending guns and not sons, S-O-N-S, not S-U-N-S. Sometimes I'm tired. And I should correct it, but instead I'm not going to. So the Italians actually pick really the worst time in world history to invade Greece. Now, they'd already started the war against the rest of Europe, and the plan was for them to go and immediately invade the Soviet Union. But the problem was Italy had already started an invasion of Greece, and they needed to make their allies look good. So instead of invading during this time where they might have been in Moscow quick enough to take the city before winter broke in, they invaded in June, and by the time they got their armies to Moscow, it was the middle of winter, and conditions got so bad that the oil in tanks would start to freeze. So really this invasion of Greece by Italy, a lot of people will point to the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans as being Hitler's biggest mistake as far as from a military standpoint. But the truth was that it was it was more. Operation Barbarossa. Now, many people saw this as Hitler's biggest strategic mistake in the war. Instead of invading in February of 1941, they invaded in June of 1941. And Germany will invade the Soviet Union with 3 million troops and 3,400 tanks, basically 80% of their forces. This is almost all of the German Army and Air Force with very little reserves. This is going to lead to a massive stalemate in the winter. Gives Great Britain time to recover. As the Nazis were invading the Soviet Union, the Soviets took a rather curious direction. If you look at the top map on the right, you see all of the arrows. You see 4 red arrows moving out to the right or out to the east. And what happens is they are moving factories. They're getting all the people that work in the factory, loading them up on a train with all the machinery for that factory, and then taking them out to the middle of nowhere, sometimes in Siberia, some places in way eastern Soviet Union. They moved 667 factories to the Urals. They moved 322 factories to Siberia, 308 factories to Central Asia, and 226 factories to the Caucasus. So by moving all this out there, they actually would take unload the machines from the trains, get the workers off, and get them building tanks, machine guns, planes, whatever they needed for warfare. And they had another crew on the trains as well that was their only job was to build buildings around these factories as they were working. This was most necessary for the ones that moved to the Urals and to Siberia, but Kazakhstan gets really cold, and even in the Urals, the winters are quite harsh. So this is going to change things, but not for about 6 to 8 months as they're getting things prepared. Now, Japan conquered French Indochina, that is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos right here. Okay? So once they conquer this territory and take it away from the French, the U.S. decides that they're no longer going to sell war materials to Japan, so they stop selling airplane fuel and scrap iron, which they needed to make steel. So once the U.S. passes the Export Control Act, then Japan allies with Germany and Italy, and things are going to go much different from this point forward. Anyway, so Admiral Yamamoto was ordered to plan an attack on Pearl Harbor. He does it against his will. He thinks it's a mistake because if they don't knock out U.S. forces, the United States has 5 times the industrial capacity of Japan, and it would be a mistake to get the United States really upset with Japan. But they attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. They had 2 waves that went into attack. The Americans had moved all of their ships into straight rows so they were easier to watch, thinking that any type of Japanese action against them would be sabotage and not a bombing run. All their planes were also put in straight lines, so when the Japanese went in with their bombers, it was easy picking since they were all in straight rows that were easy to take out. 21 ships were sunk, but all but one of them were brought back to the fight, and that was USS Arizona, which is still there to this day. 2,400 men died and thousands more were injured. But it was this action that leads the U.S. to enter World War II. It would have been too late for World War I by over 20 years since it was already over. Now, in the day after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they attacked U.S. outposts in Wake Island and Guam and Midway. And then 2 days later, Japanese troops invaded the Philippines. The whole idea was to cut off all of our supplies to Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese leader that we supported that controlled China. Now, before this happened, FDR sent MacArthur to the Philippines to build up U.S. defenses. The problem was he didn't have all the supplies or time that he needed to do this. So he once the Japanese invade on December 10th, he is finally forced to surrender and retreat. And he retreats to Australia, but he's not allowed to take his men. There were 88,000 troops, or 76,000 troops. 12,000 of them were U.S. troops. And once they were all forced to surrender, they were marched 85 miles to Japanese POW camps. This was through the mountains without supplies. The march started on April 9th and lasted until April 15th. It was quite brutal. 10,000 people died on the march, and another 24,000 people would die in the camps later on. The U.S. was being pushed back, and things looked really bad at every turn against the Japanese forces. In June of 1942, 6 months after the loss of the Philippines, the attack on U.S. forces, the Japanese had one final turn to wipe out the rest of the U.S. forces in the Pacific. This was going to be at Midway Island, where they were going to lure in all the U.S. aircraft carriers and then launch a surprise attack where they were outnumbered and destroy the U.S. aircraft carriers in the Pacific. But luckily for the United States, we had broken the Japanese naval code. And so we knew where every one of their planes was, where every one of their planes were going, and this changes the entire dynamics of the battle and really the war from this point forward. So when the attack was launched, we were able to sink all four of the Japanese carriers in this part of the fleet. And this one battle will make it so that the Japanese advance in the Pacific was halted. This is a turning point of World War II in the Pacific. Now, in Africa, what had happened was the Americans didn't start to invade Europe from England. They actually started the invasion from Africa. Planes were flown and forces were moved down to Brazil, and then from there they were flown across over to Africa, where then they would push back along North Africa and up into Europe. Now, Germany and Italy were trying to take the Suez Canal. And as the Americans and English are pushing their way east, they run into the German forces under Erwin Rommel, also known as the Desert Fox. And eventually they're going to push the Germans out of North Africa. But it was a slow process. The Battle of Stalingrad. This battle is going to be the turning point of World War II in Europe. The Germans had tried to capture Stalingrad. It was a very important strategic position because once you got past that, you controlled all of the oil fields in the Urals, and the Germans would have been unstoppable from this point. The Germans surrounded and laid siege to the city for 2 years. Somewhere around 3 million Russian civilians would die in Stalingrad during the siege. Eventually, over 2 million troops would fight to try and either capture or protect the city. And after a little bit over a year of fighting, Stalingrad was saved by the Russian army. When the battle began, they only had a gun for every 2 Soviet soldiers. So many of them were mowed down in battle. When they won in February of 1943, it was a turning point in the war because it put Germans on the defensive, and from this point, the Russian army was just about fully mobilized. They had rebuilt all of their industries in the east, and so now it was just a contest to see who would make it to Germany first. And what would seem like a very disturbing thing, or not disturbing, but strange thing to say in 2020 or 2021 or any time after probably 1979, the safest place in the world for the leader of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union to meet was in Iran. So there, the three of them met in what's called the Tehran Conference. In January of 1943, Stalin, FDR, and Churchill get together to talk about opening up a second front. The Soviets desperately needed someone to relieve some of the pressure since almost all of the German forces were fighting in the Soviet Union. The leaders there agreed that they would open a second front, but they also agreed that they would deceive the Germans about where they were going to be attacking from. Ultimately, there would be two invasion forces that would land in Europe from Britain and the United States. One of those would come through Italy, and the other one would come from Great Britain. The Battle of Kursk. This is the largest tank battle in history. All in all, there were almost 7,000 tanks between the Russians and the Soviets in one battle. There were over 2.5 million men, and somewhere around 4,500 planes were part of this battle. Once the battle began, there was so much smoke and smoke from bombs going off and guns being fired that the two lines completely got lost in the smoke. Many of the lines were completely broken through by the other side by accident. So when they found whenever everything cleared, there were tanks on both sides aiming, past their enemy. So they were almost back to back instead of nose to nose ready to fight. The Russians suffered really heavy losses, but they shifted from defense to a large counterattack, and then again the race back towards Germany is really on. The core of Germany, the remainder of Germany's force, was wiped out in this battle, and they could not stop the Russian advance. Over 1 million German troops were captured as they tried to stop the Soviets on the way back to Germany. Now, Italy. Churchill called this the soft underbelly of Europe. So Eisenhower is going to lead an invasion of Sicily in 1943. This starts about midsummer, and by August 18th, Mussolini was arrested and was arrested. About 2 weeks later, Italy surrendered. But then Hitler sent in one of his best squads to go in and rescue Mussolini and put him back in power. And Mussolini would stay in power for about 10 more months after that. In May of 1944, however, a mob went and took Mussolini and Claretta Petacci, his mistress. And about 8 months later, they broke into where they were being held, took them out, hung them on meat hooks upside down, and beat them senseless until they were dead. If you look at the image on the right there at the top, that is Mussolini and Claretta Petacci being hung upside down. And on the bottom picture, you see what they look like afterwards. They basically beat him with their fists to death, both of them. It looks like Mussolini got the worst of it, but the truth is, dead is dead. I'll have to write that sometime. So at the Casablanca conference, Stalin was not able to attend this, but this is taking place in northern Africa. So FDR and Churchill plan to increase bombing Germany. They're trying to destroy all their military capabilities, their industrial capabilities, economics, and morale. This bombing campaign that they would start would cause a severe oil shortage and destroy the railroad, which was being used to move most of the supplies when it wasn't being used to send Jews to concentration camps. It also will destroy a lot of the German aircraft, which was really superior to what the Allies had. Jets could run circles around the planes that the Americans and British were using. On the left-hand side, you see the plane there dropping all the bombs, and they drop about 20 bombs each run. And the picture on the bottom left-hand side, every one of those bombs represents a bombing run that was made successfully. So D-Day Operation Overlord. Okay, this was the Allied attack of the mainland of Europe, led by the American Dwight D. Eisenhower. There were also British and French troops that were involved in this attack as well. Uh, Now, if you look at the map on the left-hand side, you will see the top frowny face looking thing says pause to callous. That was the most logical location for an invasion. We actually attacked Normandy, which is the smiley face on the left-hand side of the screen. That was less likely because it was one of the larger distances between Britain and France. So, Pas de Calais was basically the location we wanted to fool the Germans into thinking that the Allied forces were going to attack. One of our most successful generals, George Patton, was sent there to make it appear as if a large force was going in. They called this the Ghost Fleet, okay, or the Ghost Army. They had inflatable tanks. They had inflatable landing craft and a bunch of mannequins to make it look as if this is where they were going to attack. Each day, groups of American forces moved the tanks around, and the Germans studied the new types of attack techniques that were being used by them to no avail. So June 6, 1944, this was the day that the beaches of Normandy were attacked. There were 5 beaches that were attacked. The worst of them was Omaha Beach. This was the largest amphibious assault in the history of warfare, as 150,000 men landed on the beaches on that day. There were also in support 9 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 104 destroyers and 71 U-boats. Not to mention several hundred blimps that were used for reconnaissance to see where all the German forces were. 4,500 troops, however, would die taking the beaches on that day. You can see this is just on Omaha Beach alone. You look at all the ships that are landing and all the support craft and all the blimps in the air to give everyone an idea of where the enemy was. So, just weeks after the landing in Normandy, about 6 weeks afterwards, there was an assassination plot to kill Adolf Hitler. This on the ground, it was led by a man by the name of Klaus von Stauffenberg. He was part of a German noble family, and he was fighting in North Africa. Actually, loses almost all the he lost all the fingers on one hand and 2 on the other hand. He lost his eye, and he was pretty torn up. But he was part of a group that did not They didn't want the world to think that all the Germans supported Hitler. So he goes in with a bomb. They were supposed to be meeting in a bunker that was surrounded by cinder blocks underground. And if you set off any bomb underneath that, it would have killed everyone in the room it would have killed everyone in the room. So Stauffenberg has a bomb. He's ready to go. It's go time. They moved that, instead of being underground, to a Kwanzaa hut. So Stauffenberg still goes in. He has a bomb ready to go. It's one of the first uses of plastic explosives in world history. So he puts it right underneath the table, and then he excuses himself. One of the other men in the room will move the briefcase with the bomb in it just a little bit forward, and then the blast, instead of killing Hitler, will kill 4 other men in the room. Hitler was injured as a result, but not to the point of death. White Rose was a group of German students who were also fighting against the Nazis, and they were rounded up. There's about 140 people that were executed as a result of this attempt on Hitler. Most of them were strung up by piano wire and hung in some of the places that they were meeting. So they found large rooms and just hung people. Very violent act. Horrifying act if you've seen the pictures. The Yalta Conference. This is just 3 months before the war was over. Churchill, Stalin, and FDR got together one more time and planned the world for after the war. FDR and Churchill agreed that they would allow Poland to remain communist if they had free elections to see if the people wanted to be communist. These elections were probably rigged because 100% of the population voted in favor of communism. They also tried to institute the Declaration of Liberated Europe, which would let people choose their own form of government, but depending on who was in the land, it was a democracy if it was held by the British, the French, or the Americans, and it became communist if it was held by the Soviet Union. Also, in an attempt to prevent Germany from having to pay reparations and bringing about a third world war, they agreed that the 4 nations would rebuild Berlin and Germany following the war to prevent this from happening. And there will be several complications as a result of this. For one, if you look where Berlin is located in Germany on the map on the right, it's right in the middle of Soviet territory, and if all 4 countries are rebuilding part of that, there's going to be a massive problem, and there will be. We've reached the end of yet another day. We're down to one more day in this unit, so please be prepared. Make sure you get all of your stuff turned in, and in the meantime, don't cocaine, don't AIDS, and please don't COVID. Have a great day, and thank you for being thankful. It's Chris Dugdale, MEDMA.